Okay, well, it is 1 minute afternoon, and so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today on behalf of the Agricultural Law Institute for Underrepresented and Underserved Communities at Southern University. We'd like to thank you for joining us for our The Ag Law Institute at Southern was created through a partnership with the National Agricultural Law Center that's based in Arkansas. And so we'd like to thank them for their collaboration with us. And today we are joined by April Love of the Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers Policy Center, which is housed at Alcorn University. Ms. Love is a policy analyst, and we thank her for being here today to share her expertise. And she has a lot of good information, and so I'd like to use the best use of our time so that we have some time at the end to answer any questions that the audience may have. And so I'm going to pass it over to Ms. Love so that she can get started with her presentation. Thank you for being here today. I'd also like to add that Ms. Love is an alum of Southern University Law Center, and so we like to bring back our alums to share their expertise with the world. So thank you for joining us today. We're so happy to have you, and here you go.
Thank you, Ebony, and thank you and Southern for having me come and join you all to talk about a topic that is being discussed a lot right now, but it is very near and dear to my heart and is central to the work that I do at the Policy Center at Alcorn. So as Ebony mentioned before, my name is April Love. I serve as the policy analyst at the Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers Policy Research Center located at Alcorn State University. I will say now that when it comes to talking about the about that policy center, we just call it the Policy Center. It is a mouthful, and I'm sure our friends at Southern University Law Center can understand the need to shorten the name of our center and our organization. So today, what I'm here to discuss with you all is the Farm Bill and how it relates to the minority farmer or the socially disadvantaged farmer. And so what we're going to do today is just give an overview of the Farm Bill so that you have an understanding of what it is and how it works, and then talk about how that process is working currently with the Farm Bill that we are waiting on. And then I'll also discuss a little bit about how my office, the Policy Center, is related to the Farm Bill. So we're going to start with the Farm Bill overview. And I feel like understanding the Farm Bill is the best way to actually understand agricultural policy and how it relates to not just farm operations, but anything that is related to agriculture. And I'm just here to say right now that there's a lot of things that are interconnected and related to agriculture. So the first question is, what is the Farm Bill? So the Farm Bill is a comprehensive piece of legislation that contains agricultural and food policies. So the Farm Bill is not just related to agriculture, it also deals with food and nutrition. And I'm here to tell you now that the food and nutrition title of the Farm Bill makes up the most of the Farm Bill. It's revised every 5 years by Congress. We'll talk about that a little bit later, how that doesn't always happen. It includes and contains 12 titles that address agricultural resources and programs. Each aspect of the Farm Bill goes through a process of proposal, debate, and approval by Congress before it is passed over and signed into law by the president. The current Farm Bill that we are operating under right now is the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018, and you guys are probably saying, April, that's well over 5 years ago. I know, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later in the presentation. So there are 12 titles of the Farm Bill, and I'm going to go through every title of the Farm Bill. because each title is imperative to a farmer's operation, whether they know it or not, or even historically marginalized communities, rural communities as a whole, and even urban communities. So Title One dictates commodities, and it provides price and income support for farmers of non-perishable crops. So that's corn, soybeans and wheat. Um, Dairy and sugar are also included in this title. Sugar being included is very imperative to the state of Louisiana, because there is a lot of sugar farming in the state of Louisiana. It also includes agricultural disaster assistance, also very important for the state of Louisiana, as they are, like the state of Mississippi and other coast states that have coastal lines, are often impacted by environmental issues. Title Two deals with conservation, and that deals with programs that help farmers implement natural resource conservation efforts on their working lands. So that's pastures and croplands. And that also includes land retirement and easement programs. Title Three is the trade title. The trade title covers food export subsidy programs and international food aid programs. Title Four is the biggie of the Farm Bill, and you'll see that a little bit later in the presentation. That's the nutrition title. And that includes Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and also known as SNAP, and other small programs that may help low income Americans afford to eat and have food. Our next title, I told y'all we got 12 titles. The Farm Bill is long. Um, so the next title is credit. And the credit title provides federal loan programs to help farmers access financial resources and credit to help grow and sustain their farming operations. The next title, Title Six, is rural development. Rural development covers programs that help with rural economic growth through rural business and community development. It also includes rural housing and infrastructure. Title Seven is the research, extension, and anything related to that title. So that title is going to give funds to farm and food research, education, and extension programs. And so extension programs are like at Southern University, where they have extension agents that come out to your farm, or they host events that help you gain a better understanding of resources that are available to you as a farmer. And they support innovation training for the next generation of farmers and ranchers. The next title is the forestry title, and that also supports conservation programs, but it's focused on farmers and rural communities being able to manage and protect forest resources. Title Nine is the energy title, and so it supports programs for biofuel production, renewable energy system installation, and any energy related research. Title 10 is horticulture, and that deals with farmers markets and local food programs. It also funds research and for fruits, vegetables, and other horticulture crops. And it also houses the organic farming and certification programs. Title 11 deals with crop insurance. So this title offers premium subsidies for farmers and insurance companies to protect against crop losses. And it also is where the Department of Agriculture's Risk Management Agency, RMA, is housed, and gives it authority to develop and adjust insurance policies. And the final title, I know this was a lot, the final title is the miscellaneous title. So that's just anything else that could be in the Farm Bill that is related to agriculture. That's going to include support for beginning and socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, veteran farmers, agricultural labor safety, workforce development, livestock health. I personally feel that the miscellaneous title is often overlooked by people who do work dealing with agriculture, especially agriculture policy development. And it could actually be the most imperative title to creating programs that center around racial equity and advocacy for farmers, especially farmers of color and farmers and minority farmers. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about the miscellaneous title toward the end of the presentation today, but those are the 12 titles of the Farm Bill. So now that we've gone over what exactly is in the Farm Bill, and again, this is just a short synopsis. The Farm Bill is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. So within these titles, there's just tons of detail within them that dictates how much money can be given, who has the authority to do what, how they have to do it, all that kind of stuff to a certain extent. So the next thing that needs to be discussed is what exactly is the farm bill process like? So, how do we get a farm bill? You might be thinking, April, why don't we have a new farm bill right now? We'll talk about that later. The farm bill process follows a similar process to any other piece of congressional legislation that you may be privy to. It may follow a similar pattern to state legislature if you are familiar with state level legislative making. So on two sides within the agricultural space, we have the House Agricultural Committee and we have the Senate Committee on Agriculture. Um, they both work to a certain extent separately. So, what I don't have up here is kind of how they get the farm bill process started. So, prior to putting together these things that I have listed here called drafts, they often do a lot of hearings on specific topics. So for example, we were contacted at one point by the House Agriculture, by one side of the House Agriculture Committee, and we were asked to testify um, on a specific topic. That topic was new and beginning farmers and credit. What we did was we prepared one of our advisory board members and they logged into Zoom. Those were the days of everything being on Zoom. And they testified to the research and the data that we had in our office pertaining to access to credit. Those credit aspect that I mentioned that was in one of the titles before, and its impact on not just new and beginning farmers, but new and beginning farmers of color. So usually both the Senate and the House Agriculture Committee will hold these hearings. These hearings are accessible on YouTube. They live stream them when they have them, and the calendar is up on both of their websites. So after they've held these hearings, and sometimes in conjunction with holding these hearings, they will then begin to draft a farm bill. And this is just a draft. They'll draft one on both sides. Now here I have it saying committee draft, committee draft. So you're thinking, okay, so there's just one draft on the Senate, one draft on the House side. No, that's not always how it works. So, for example, right now, pertaining to what was supposed to be the 2023 Farm Bill is now being called the 2024 Farm Bill, could possibly be the 2025 Farm Bill. On the Senate side, there are two Farm Bill drafts. So, there's a draft from the House Agriculture Committee Republicans, and there's a draft from the Senate Agriculture Committee Democrats. They have two separate farm bills. And on the House side, they have kind of done the same thing, although currently there is a bill that has come out of committee already. And we can talk about that when we talk about the actual current working farm bill. So, essentially they'll come together as a committee and put forth one draft. In the committee, they will go in and have a hearing on the draft farm bill on both sides. So the House committee has already had a hearing on their draft farm bill. They will discuss and amend aspects of the farm bill, and in the end, after many hours, I will say that the when the House Agriculture Committee had their hearing on the farm bill, they were in there for hours and hours. They didn't finish up and actually vote on the bill until the next day, and they were there the entire time. And this hearing is often called a markup. And so after many amendments and we amend this, and they debated on it and they discussed it, finally they will pass a draft out of the committee. Once it's passed out of the committee, each draft from the Senate and the House will go down to the floor. It'll go down to the House floor and the Senate floor, where it'll happen all over again. It'll be debated, it'll be amended, and then eventually voted on. And then after it's voted on, it will come out of the House and it will come out of the Senate. And then they will form what is called a conference committee, which is a some of the Senate, and then Senate Agriculture Committee members and some of the House Agriculture Committee members. They come together and they essentially combine the Senate and the House farm bills. After they've combined the Senate and the House farm bills, they then take it out of the conference committee and it goes back to the House and the Senate floor. And I want to note that those bills need to be identical when they go to the Senate. So, unlike before when it went to the House and the Senate floor and it was two separate bills, when it goes to the House and Senate for the last time, they need to be the same bill. And so, if both the Senate and the House are able to vote on and pass the bill, then that one document will go to the president, and the president will either sign it into law, or the president will veto the bill. The president will say, I don't like this, veto, and they'll send it back to the House and the Senate. So that is not necessary. That is how the process is working right now. But there's many ins and outs. It seems like it should be fairly simple. But when it comes to politics and the political process, things are not always simple when it comes to getting legislation, especially legislation of this size, passed. So next up on the farm bill process, and we're not going to go into great detail about this, but in the farm bill, it's going to say that X amount of dollars can go to this, X amount of dollars can go to that, that matters. But Congress then, after the president has signed the bill into law, they have to go through the appropriations process, and that's basically setting money aside in the federal budget to be able to fund the programs in the farm bill. So the conservation programs, the research programs, anything funding related. So I want to know, because this has been a huge topic of discussion, especially with the current farm bill or the potential farm bill being delayed, that there are some farm bill programs that are guaranteed in funding. And that is due to the fact that they deal with mandatory spending or mandatory funding. And so they are automatically supported every single year. Then there are other programs that are funded through discretionary spending or discretionary funding, which means that it has to go back every single year and be decided how much, if any, will be awarded to that program in order for it to take place. At the same time, the rulemaking process is taking place. And so the rulemaking process is done by the Department of Agriculture, where they will write the rules for how the programs will work. So, Congress has passed that there will be this program. It's in the Farm Bill that there's going to be this program. Take, for example, urban agriculture provisions, where they decided that there was going to be an office created that deals specifically with urban agriculture. Well, Congress has said that it's a thing and it's going to be a thing, and who's going to have the authority to do it, and all of this, who's going to oversee it, and who's responsible for it. Well, now the Department of Agriculture has to go in and actually determine and write out how that program will be implemented and how it will work. Who's within that office, where is that office going to be located, all of those different things. So that is pretty much what the small scale of what the Farm Bill contains, the 12 titles in various different areas related to agricultural programming and food and nutrition. The process that Congress has to go through to actually get a farm bill, what happens after you have the farm bill, and how money is actually given to each of the programs that you all may be familiar with, and then how we actually get the programs implemented in the end. Okay. So I wanted to put this up here because I think it segues us into the next conversation. And you may be thinking, okay, April, where's the farm bill? Where did it go? So the farm bill is divided up when it comes to funding, and you'll see right here that the nutrition title takes up most of the funding. And that is because even though the Farm Bill is called the Farm Bill is a nutrition bill. It is most of it is devoted to nutrition. And so, as we segue in and discuss what is actually happening right now with the current Farm Bill, that, like I said before, was supposed to be the 2023 Farm Bill, is now the 2024 Farm Bill, was supposed and could possibly be the 2025 Farm Bill. I will say that much of the debate and discussion as it pertains to the Farm Bill is cuts in spending to the nutrition title. So, in providing an update on where we are currently with any hopes of discussing or getting a new farm bill, we need to start with where we were before in the process. So, probably since 2022, the Department of Agriculture has been hosting hearings and bringing in stakeholders, people who work with farmers and ranchers, people who have, I guess you could call it, skin in the game. And they've been listening to what they have to say about the Farm Bill and what they want to see in the Farm Bill. With that, I will add that the process and the working toward a new farm bill has not been the most bipartisan. So bipartisan means that both parties are working together to create the piece of legislation, get it passed, and make sure that things are funded and all of that kind of stuff. Um, and that is why, as I mentioned earlier, on the Senate side, you see two separate farm bills. You have a farm bill that was developed by the Senate Republican committee members, and a farm bill that was created by the Senate Democratic Party members. And those farm bills, while there may be some overlap there, are generally going to be pretty different. As I said before, a lot of the debate right now is nutrition and conservation, where one side would like to cut more funding to nutrition, to SNAP, and one side is saying no, we should either leave it where it is, or we need to give more money to SNAP and the nutrition title. And so that has created a holdup. On the House side, there was a draft farm bill presented by the House Republicans. And it was brought to committee for what we discussed earlier, that it's called a markup, or it's a hearing, but it's called a markup. They debated, they discussed, they amended, they marked up the bill as a whole. They were there for hours, and eventually it ended up passing out of committee. And so, as we discussed earlier, now that it's passed out of committee, it will go to the House floor. Um, Congress is currently on recess, so that it won't go to the House floor until they come back from recess. But there may be tons of bills, especially bills that deal with appropriations, or greater funding needs, that are in front of that bill. Nothing has gone to markup on the Senate side quite yet. So hopefully, and so that is the issue, is that we have all of these different farm bills floating around, and hopefully eventually they will come together. They were supposed to come together in 2023, and they did not. And so now they're working toward being able to come up with a farm bill within the year of 2024. Right now, there's an extension on the 2018 Farm Bill that I believe goes until the end of September, and that is when that extension expires. They are able to extend it again. But as I mentioned earlier, with the mandatory and discretionary spending, if it weren't extended, which it probably will be, anything that it has mandatory funding would stay and it would still be able to function and it would still be able to work. But anything with discretionary spending, if the Farm Bill 2018 Farm Bill were not extended, would pretty much expire. There would be no more funding for it without a new Farm Bill that included that program. So right now, we are in a bit of a waiting game as it pertains to the potential farm bill. And I will say that even though it makes you feel impatient, that gives time for organizations and offices like mine and institutions like Southern University Law Center to continue doing research and determining what is needed for that farm bill. So I think that leads to a question of, what exactly does my office do with the farm bill, and why is our work so important for minority farmers? If I can go to the next slide. So I will move on without going to the next slide because it is not letting me go to the next slide. Okay. So how does the policy center factor into the farm bill? So what you may not know is that the policy center, where my office is housed at Alcorn State University, was actually authorized in the 2014 Farm Bill. And so in this farm bill, in the miscellaneous title, remember earlier I said that the miscellaneous title was actually very important, and it houses a lot of things that are related to advocacy and equity and creating pathways for people to have functioning farm operations. We were put in the 2014 Farm Bill, and it was stated that there was to be a policy center that was devoted to socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, collecting data, putting forth policy recommendations to ensure that the voice of a socially disadvantaged farmer or rancher was heard in Congress. So we were designed to conduct the research, analyze the policy, make the recommendations in order to achieve equitable. And I want to focus here on the term equitable, because we push equity instead of equality, because we want to ensure that our farmers of color are not only getting the same thing as everyone else, but they're given the opportunity to catch up from being excluded from things that they should have had in the past. So making sure that there is equitable and economic integration of primarily USDA programs and policies for the socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers and the communities that they live in and rural landowners. So how does the policy center work? So we have these 6 research priority areas, and they are constantly growing. We're constantly adding on new things. So the first research area that we typically deal with is the impact of current agricultural policy on socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. So we look at, how we look at things like the 2018 Farm Bill, and we say, okay, how is that impacting FDFRs in practice? Um, has have things been done that were said they were going to be done? I will use it as an example. In the 2008 Farm Bill, it was mandated that there was supposed to be transparency and accountability from the Department of Agriculture. They were supposed to be publishing demographics um, pertaining to their programs and things of that nature, and it was never done. And so, in doing research, we found that out, and we were able to have discussions about the fact, like, hey, this was actually supposed to be done in the from the 2008 Farm Bill, and it has not been done yet. What can we do to make sure that this is something that takes place going forward? And so that's an example of looking at current agricultural policies. Or we'll look at something like the heirs property relending program, and we'll say, okay, how is that actually going? How is that actually working? What might need to change? Our next research area is land loss among African American farmers, and that includes heirs property, as I just mentioned before. So, with that, we are digging into how much heirs property is there, how are they classifying heirs property within the legal system, what is creating the heirs property that is out there, how do we prevent more heirs property, how do we clear title, and things like that. The next research area that we have is participation in of SDFRs and USDA programs. So that's just it's very simple. Are socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers able to and having access to programs that are created and put on by the Department of Agriculture? Are if they're not participating in programs, why are they not? What is the issue? And it's going to vary from state to state, from region to region, why they're not participating in certain programs. The next research area is access to and use of resources. And so that's going to include technology. So, technology that farmers can use to advance their farm operations. That's going to include access to broadband. That's going to include access to credit. So, our farmers able to access farm loans to help fund their operations and access to capital? Are they able to actually generate money off of their farm operations? And then we recently added two new areas, which is youth programs and pipelines. So that is looking at what is there currently for youth, which a lot of you may think of 4-H or manners, and how we can create more of a pipeline to bring in more young people to the agricultural sector. Um, and then we also have community and urban agriculture, which I mentioned earlier, which is looking at urban agriculture, what the needs are, what the barriers are, and ensuring that people in urban spaces are able to farm. So we have our research priority areas, but we also have policy priority areas that function similarly. So after the research is done, our office works with the Congressional Black Caucus, the House Agriculture Committee, and the Senate Agriculture Committee. And what we do is we take that research and we develop recommendations, and we submit those recommendations to those three entities. And so, with that, we will often submit congressional recommendations, but we also might, throughout the year, submit procedural recommendations, and those are going to go oftentimes to the Department of Agriculture. So we may host a listening session with farmers in a certain region, and we'll see that there may be an issue with a USDA program that the farmers have continuously discussed in those listening sessions, and we'll just take that directly to USDA and say, "Hey, here's the issue," just so they're aware of it. But our policy recommendations, which go to Congress, are very similar. The only addition to that is that we also submit recommendations that pertain to the 1890 land grant institutions. And so those are mostly going to be concentrated on equity, funding equity, because if the 1890 land grant institutions are not funded in an equitable manner, especially compared to 1862s, they're unable to function. And we have found in surveys that farmers of color really enjoy being able to receive extension services from from 1890 land grant institutions. They enjoy working with the 1890 land grant institutions, but if those institutions are not funded properly, they're unable to have the staff needed to be able to send those people out to work with those farmers, put on programs and things of that nature. And then our big overarching policy priority area is racial equity. As I mentioned before, racial equity drives pretty much every aspect of our recommendations that we submit to Congress. And with that being central, our ultimate goal is to ensure that farmers of color, minority farmers, have equitable access to anything related to USDA and within the agricultural industry to ensure that they are able to catch up to what they probably should have had in the past. So, with that being said, that pretty much ends my presentation. My PowerPoint did freeze, but I'm going to try to get it back up in a second. But I do, the resources that I used to put together the presentation today, I used some resources from the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. I used some materials from the Congressional Research Service, and I used a congressional desk book that talks more about Congress in depth. If I'm able to send this PowerPoint over to Ebony, you'll be able to have the titles of everything that I utilize if you want to do some more in-depth research. And with that being said, I am open to taking questions.
Thank you so much for letting me know that I was on mute. But I was thinking, April, I was saying that I've already received positive feedback about your presentation, that the information was helpful, and you've already addressed one question that I received, whether or not you would be willing to share your slides, especially since it froze. I know that during our prep session, you had some really good information at the end and charts. So for everyone who wants a copy of it, I'll make sure that I forward it to you. What we will do, or my hope, is that we'll be able to post this recording on the Ag Law Institute's webpage and also post a copy of the slides there, or email them to the participants. And so at this point, we have opened up to any questions, and so I am watching the chat. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat or the Q&A. And Ms. Love is happy to answer those questions. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, could you, because during the presentation, you used some acronyms and talked about some things that people may not be familiar with. So when you refer to SDFRs, what does that mean?
Okay, so you said related to SDFRs, what does that mean?
Yes, in case anyone isn't sure, you were throwing that term out, and I just want to make sure everyone knows exactly what you meant by an SDFR.
So SDFR stands for socially disadvantaged farmer or rancher. And that term has often two separate definitions. So one definition is just race-based. So that includes Black or African American, Hispanic or Latinx, Native American, Indian, Asian, Pacific Islander. And I may be missing one there, but I think that should be it. There's another definition that floats around, and that definition also includes women, which means that it includes all women of all races. And so some Department of Agriculture agencies and programs utilize one definition. Some Department of Agriculture agencies and programs use another definition. And I think that when determining which definition is used to discuss socially disadvantaged farmer or rancher, when we have when programs and stuff like that are developed, especially when it deals with funding for these farmers and ranchers, the more people you include, the smaller the pot gets, which means that there's less funding that is there for each individual person. So I think that that is why definition can often really matter which one you're using. Some definitions also include veterans. It just depends on the agency in determining who's using what definition. I know at the Policy Center, one of our recommendations um, has been to only use the definition that relates to race, because oftentimes, as it relates to race, they are using the historical discrimination against farmers of color as a valid point for creating the program, for giving the funding and all of that kind of stuff. So that's what SDFR means. Multiple definitions and things like that, but generally, from the Policy Center standpoint, it's those groups of farmers of color.
Okay. Another question or point of clarification that I'd like you to make, you were referring to 1890s. So for anyone who may not be familiar with 1890s, could you explain?
Yes. So 1890s were created, and Ebony, you can correct me if I'm wrong, in the Second Morale Act
Yes.
in 1890. So prior to that, there were 1862, and those are land grant institutions that were pretty much created to do agricultural research and train up people to pretty much farm and create farming operations. Um, so there were a certain amount of universities that were created or designated as 1862s in the first Morale Act. And then in the second Morale Act, they decided to designate the land grant status to schools starting in 1890. Southern University is an 1890 land grant. Alcorn State University, where my office is located, is an 1890 land grant university. There are also land grants that are Hispanic serving. I want to say those are 1990, don't quote me. And then there are Native American serving institutions that I want to say are 1992s. And so they were given that land grant status. And so even amongst all of those institutions, there is an inequity in the funding that they receive, and therefore the resources that they're able to give to the farmers that they serve in their communities.
Thank you for that explanation. So now to get back to the Farm Bill, so you talked about it being extended last year and the possible extension of it again this year. What does that mean? Would that create any complications for funding or, programming by these extensions?
So the only way, so generally when there is an extension, a formalized extension by Congress, there shouldn't create any problems or any issues. If there's not an extension formally done by Congress, that is when we get into the issue with the mandatory versus discretionary spending. Things that are funded, have mandatory spending will remain. They'll still be able to function and things of that nature. But if it's discretionary spending, it will not continue, will not be able to function. It won't have any funding anymore to actually do the programs. So that's the only issue that comes into play. I want to say, this is not the first time that the Farm Bill has been quote unquote late. The 2014 Farm Bill was supposed to be the 2013 Farm Bill, and it was not. And so this is not the first time that it's happened. Historically, I mean, had to delay the farm bill for years, in some instances. So it's not something I would be overly concerned about. There are certain groups that are very concerned about it because they're worried about issues coming up with funding and appropriations and things of that nature. But as I mentioned earlier, for those who work in the advocacy space, that gives more time to continue to develop research, gather data, put together recommendations for Congress, talk to your congressional member, fly up to DC. A lot of organizations like the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, they host fly-ins and things like that. So that gives a little bit more time to really dig in deep to the issues, to really create sustainable solutions, especially for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers.
Thank you. You were reading my mind because I definitely was about to ask you for tips or recommendations for anyone who might want to be more active as it relates to the Farm Bill, things that they could do, but you've already addressed that. So
Well,
thank you so
I will
much.
add, I will add,
Okay.
so within my office, as I mentioned earlier, we were authorized in the Farm Bill to gather this data, to work with cooperatives, to work with institutions like Southern University Law Center. We work with a couple of other schools to develop these policy recommendations. With us developing these policy recommendations, we have podcasts, we host listening sessions, and things like that. And joining and participating in these listening sessions is one way for anyone who is interested in becoming more involved in the legislative process for the Farm Bill to have their voice heard. So like if you're a farmer or a rancher, or you do any type of food justice work, one good way to get involved is, when we send out these invitations to, we hosted a minority farmers conference. At that minority farmers conference, I pretty much did this exact same presentation for the farmers who were there. And those farmers were able to actually go through their issues and challenges and come up with solutions themselves. And then the next day, we had a congressional panel discussion where congressional staffers from the House and the Senate and some former staffers who are now in different sectors but still working in government relations and policy development, they came in person and they talked to the farmers, they listened to the issues, they listened to the concerns. So participating in things like that, a lot of these community-based organizations are hosting similar events. We're working with some of them to host similar events. But that is, I think, one way to get involved. Our office sends out a newsletter quarterly, which with information. I provide updates on what is going on the Hill, so that you can become, knowledgeable on what is actually going on in the moment. And I know, Ebony, you also send out similar newsletters and things like that about what's going on the legal side of things, but the legal is also the political and the policy, so they go hand in hand.
Yes. So we have our first audience question.
Oh, okay.
And so the question is, can you explain the process of how you all make recommendations? For example, do you all communicate with the agriculture community to hear the needs of underrepresented farmers, or are recommendations data-driven?
It's a mix of both. And I hate that my slideshow wasn't up there because I kind of had it mapped out in the process that we use. So we start with our research projects. So what we do is we send out a request for proposals. We send them out to the 1862s, the 1890s, other universities, community-based organizations, anybody who may be an expert on that topic. So for example, we sent out an RFP, request for proposal, on crop insurance. We're wanting somebody to do research on the socially disadvantaged farmer and their access to crop insurance, their experience with crop insurance. So that whoever ends up getting that funding, they will then do the research on crop insurance. After they're done with that research on crop insurance, I will then begin working with them to develop those recommendations. After those recommendations are done, if we have a new farm bill, I'll just kind of put those in my arsenal for the next farm bill. But if we don't have a new farm bill, I will just update the recommendations that we already have, and send them as updated to the Congressional Black Caucus, the House Agriculture Committee, and the Senate Agriculture Committee. At the same time, before we send off any recommendations, we have a community-based, I guess you could say, process that it goes through. So after the research is done, we will sometimes host listening sessions. Sometimes they'll be in conjunction with like a small farmers conference that many 1890 land grants host. So if it's a listening session, it'll probably be on Zoom, or we'll do it in conjunction with another conference, like I mentioned before. So what we'll do is we'll go over the research, what was found, and we'll ask the farmers, did we miss something here? Is there something that didn't show up in this research? And so the reason why we do that is because we need to determine if we need to do more research on the topic. Now, if they say, oh, this is great, this is everything, those address my concerns, this is exactly what I'm seeing as well, then it goes on to the recommendation phase. Before we put those recommendations into our formalized recommendation document and send it off, we have another listening session. So, for example, when I did the listening session in February, I went over the recommendations that the Policy Center had. And the discussion after that is, what are we missing in these recommendations? What is an issue or challenge that you are having that does not show up in these recommendations? And if you had a solution for that issue or challenge, what do you envision that it would be? And so we do some breakout groups and some discussion and stuff like that. And sometimes they're like, nope, this is it. That's my challenge. That recommendation solves it. Sometimes there's more to it. And so if there's more to it, sometimes that might require more research. Sometimes it's just a tweak to the recommendation. And so then we send it off. So that's kind of like the community aspect. We do a lot of partnering, like I said, with community-based organizations. So for example, at the end of September, I will be attending the Alcorn State University Small Farmers Conference. At that Small Farmers Conference, I will be providing the farmers who attend that conference an update on what is going on, on the Hill with the Farm Bill, taking questions, issues and concerns, things of that nature, so that, we can inform anyone who asks us, like, hey, what's going on, on the ground. But we are a small but mighty team. So we oftentimes require partnering with other groups, other schools, so that we can kind of combine our talents to be able to ensure that we're actually getting the work done on behalf of these farmers and ranchers. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. So you mentioned during your presentation that there are 3 versions of the Farm Bill, or 3 draft versions of the Farm Bill that are floating around. Is there anything in particular that socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, or the so-called underserved, underrepresented ag communities, should pay particular attention to?
I would say, and you made me think of this, and I'm gonna be real. That bill is, the draft House bill is like 100 something pages.
Yeah.
So there's a lot in there. So the first thing I'll start with is that and you can we're working on behalf of racial equity, and so you can already kind of know that a lot of our recommendations did not show up in that version of the Farm Bill. So I would not say that is something to be concerned with, but that's a note that I would make there, is that there is a lack of things in that Farm Bill that can create progress. There may be some things in there that could be helpful to socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, but nothing that could create that progress. Now, one thing that I would like to note is that throughout that draft farm bill, and throughout, I want to say all of them, and within the Department of Agriculture, they are moving toward using the term historically underserved producer or underserved producer. And what we have found that using the terminology of historically underserved or underserved producer, that's like 80% of farmers and ranchers. And so when you're creating programs or funding programs, and instead of saying socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers by this definition, instead you're saying historically underserved producer, you are now creating a program for 80% of the farming community. And so you can only think about how that dwindles down the amount of funding that is available to someone who is considered a socially disadvantaged farmer and rancher, somebody who is trying to just get ahead with their farming operation, someone who has faced discrimination in the past, so they didn't have access to certain programs in the past, and now they're supposed to have access to these programs, but now everybody has access to the program except for like 20% of the farming population. So I think that is one area that we have flagged on our end, is that switch over to a new use of terminology. At one point, the Policy Center was kind of the opinion that we should just call people what we call people, because what we found is that when people were making justifications for certain programming or funding, they were using the history and the history of one group of people to justify the need for every single person within this large group. But that there's a lot of money tied into the term socially disadvantaged farmer. So that would be a very difficult transition. But I would say that transitioning to using the term historically underserved or underserved producer could be even more detrimental to farmers of color having access to funding and programming that they need to be able to rectify the historical discriminations that have prevented them from having access to those programs before.
Thank you so much. So we have 2 minutes left, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I do want to state for anyone who's interested in reading those draft proposals, if you just do a quick Google search for the Farm Bill, or go to the House Ag Committee or Senate Ag Committee website, they do have the draft proposals of the bill there. There's also a synopsis, because the actual draft, I believe, is over 900 pages. And so they do have a synopsis and condensed version of that will give you the highlights. So anyone who's interested in that, feel free to check that out. Thank you all for your time. We really appreciate having you with us today for this discussion. Thank you again to Ms. Love for sharing her knowledge and expertise. We really appreciate you coming. And on behalf of the Southern University Law Center's Agricultural Law Institute for Underrepresented and Underserved Communities and our partner, the National Ag Law Center, we thank you for being here today. Please visit our webpage at www.sulc.edu/ALI for a list of our upcoming webinars and to register for them. We do have another webinar scheduled for next Thursday at noon, where Julia Peebles of Ducks Unlimited will be joining us to continue our discussion on the Farm Bill, but she will specifically be focusing on conservation. And with that, that's all, folks. We appreciate you coming. Again, thank you to Ms. Love and the Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers Policy Center for their support of SULC and the Ag Law Institute. And we'll see you next time. Bye.